Hi, everybody. This is my first time speaking at RailsConf, so I've got a little bit of nervous energy, so wave at me or something if I start talking too fast. All right, so yeah, talk about reacting to Hotwire. Click the button the other way. There we go. I'm currently a staff engineer at CareRev. CareRev is, I'm going to quote the company description because it sounds better than what I would come up with. CareRev is a labor marketplace platform that connects hospitals and health systems with local, vetted healthcare professionals on demand. The key idea being helping healthcare professionals have more control over their schedule to be able to also have what they want to have in their life. And we are hiring, so I think that we've got a booth in the exhibit hall. So if you're at all interested, please come see us. And we're not really using Hotwire quite yet. That might have changed in the last day or so. We had a pull request go through from one of the other teams that was going to start using Hotwire, so that was exciting to see. So let's talk about React. This is, as Brittany mentioned, this is kind of a storytelling track a bit in terms of the experiences that we've had doing different things. And so if I'm going to talk about this transition away from React, I have to talk about React a bit first. And I'm a little bit afraid that this talk is going to give the impression that I dislike React, and that's not really the case. I also am going to have a lot of Star Wars things in here, so I hope there's some Star Wars fans in here. Like, they're still good in React. React has been able to do a lot of things for me. The one break I took from Rails professionally was a 6-month contract at a React shop to learn React better from people using it as their primary development language and framework. So there's a lot of things that it can do really well. There's a lot of things that really attracted me to it to begin with. So here's, from the React website, like the kind of stated intent of React to make it painless to create interactive UIs and design views for your application state. And React does this really, really well. And as a developer coming to React with very little experience with React up front, it makes it really easy to get started, right? There's very little that you have to deal with in terms of data transport layer or application state and all these other things. You don't really have to think about those when you're really just learning React from the ground up, because the whole point is just you're going to build this UI. So this is one of the big things that really made me super happy when I was first learning React, is the ability to use the browser extensions for the React DevTools. So I found this repo online. It's this really simple tic-tac-toe game, and then in the components panel, you can see like the name of the components that are rendered in this little mini application. And every React application I've ever worked on, if you know the name of the component, you can find the file instantly. If I want to adjust how the box component renders or what it does, I'm just going to look for a file called box.js, and I can do whatever I need to do. I don't have to go look for that file. It's a very kind of almost Rails-esque assumption about how the code should be structured and where it should be that really appealed to me. So let's talk about the job that I was in when I had to start making this transition. So it really wasn't that long ago. It was really in 2019 at a previous job. So I was a developer number 2 in this company, and after I got hired, we eventually scaled up to 5 developers, 2 of which were JavaScript developers. And we had 3 projects that we were supporting. One project was a kind of internal auditing tool to kind of keep everything ordered and structured. Another project was this new kind of health program that we were launching that had never quite launched. It was kind of waiting on other companies to sign on to it. And then the third project was the project that the business was primarily run on. The company managed surgery centers, and so this was the application that nurses would use to log in, to fill out all the paperwork incidental to a surgery that was being performed. Of those 3 projects, one of them is clearly more important than the others. And that was the one that also, the structure of the, before I go there, so yeah, one of those projects is more important than the others. And then over the course of 3 months, we lost 3 of our developers, including the 2 JavaScript developers who built and maintained the React portion of that super important application. So that kind of necessitated some changes. before I talk about this change really fast, when I talk about the structure of that application. So on the Rails side, it was an API that fed data to the React app. There's an admin site where company employees could log in to make some changes and manage the domain data. And there's a sprinkling of React in some of those admin pages, nothing approaching a single-page application style system, but just to kind of give it some dynamic flavor and to provide some feature sets that HTML can't do on its own. Another React application, so I thought, was fairly simple with just React and was set up with the create React app CLI. So that's what I thought I was walking into when I needed to begin supporting and maintaining this application. So this is the simple change that broke me. So in this application, there's a little drop-down menu. It opens up and it's got these 4 items. What the request was to add a new 5th item, this remove link. Clicking that link is going to open a modal with a form in it. They fill out that form, submit the form, and this piece of documentation gets removed from the patient that this screen was for. This sounds like such a simple change, right? So first off, where's this code? So this is an example, the previous example from the tic-tac-toe screen of what I expected to be able to see when opening up the React DevTools. Instead, when I open up React DevTools, this is what I see. I'm so glad that got the reaction I was looking for. This tells me absolutely nothing about the structure of the application, about what components are being rendered or where, and it just boggled my mind. At the time, I thought this was the fault of the developers who built the system, but in preparing for this talk, I was looking for, like that tic-tac-toe application I pulled up earlier, I was looking for something like that to use to get a screenshot for what I did like, and I thought for sure some of these examples on the React JS homepage would give me what I wanted, but every single one of these examples exhibited the same behavior, which led me to believe, okay, this isn't really something that the developers in question did. This was more something probably in Create React app. I hadn't been able to dig in deep enough to figure out what's causing it or if I could disable it, but it was something more endemic to React than what I was comfortable dealing with. So I had to spend a decent amount of time just figuring out what components were rendered where so I could figure out how to make this change. So as I'm working through that process, trying to figure out what I need to change and where, I had certain expectations, I can talk, expectations about what the changelog was ultimately going to look like. On the Rails side, I knew I was going to need to make a change to the routes because there's this new endpoint that needs to be hit to remove the documentation. And there have to be a new action in the forms controller, essentially, to perform that action. And then these next 2 bullet points are expressed in Rails terms, even though I knew that they would be in React. I'm going to have to find the spot in the menu to add that link. I'm going to have to find the form to add that modal so that the actual UI components are in place. This is what I hoped the changelog would ultimately look like. And then by the time the changelog was done, this is what it looked like. Because I was a little bit disingenuous before when I said that the application was just React. So yeah, I probably was a little bit energetic and animated about this problem at the time, just because it's such a simple change. I'm adding a link and adding a modal in a form. Why do I have to hit a dozen different files to add this into the system, right? So yeah, I tended to get a little bit animated. So back to the structure of this application. It wasn't just React. There was Redux in there. On top of Redux, there's this another thing called Rekit, which even talking with other React developers at the time, several of them expressed fascination with, what's Rekit? I've never heard of that one before. I was like, oh, great. That bodes well for me. So Rekit is this, comes with a development IDE that's kind of built alongside it called Rekit Studio. And this is kind of what Rekit Studio looks like by default. And most of the UI I kind of get, there's the file explorer on the left and the test coverage on the right and those boxes with some kind of dashboard indicators along the top. But that overview diagram in the middle kind of broke my mind a little bit because I don't know what that is and I'm a little bit afraid to try and learn what that is. So I was not excited about figuring out how to use Rekit. So this is when I kind of realized I needed to convince my managers that we needed to make a change, that without the JavaScript developers who built that system initially, we didn't really have the skill set and the buffer in our overhead in order to really continue to manage and maintain that application. And this is how I expected the conversation to go in terms of convincing the managers that we need to take 4 months off of maintaining the current application and rebuild it from scratch using Hotwire. Because Hotwire is the way in terms of what I wanted to do and how I felt like this application needed to be built. So one of the big things I hoped to offer in this talk was some tips for how to try and make that argument. The first point was that the closer they are to feeling the pain, the more likely they are to understand the need for a change. Thankfully, in my case, my team lead, the one other developer who was with the company, and our director had both worked fairly closely with the JavaScript developers during the development of the initial application. So they were aware of a lot of the pain points and a lot of the struggles that they had gone through and continued to have in maintaining that application. So thankfully, I didn't have to have that Darth Vader moment in terms of really trying to convince them the next point was that to really start with something small so that you can prove to yourself and to them that this is going to work. If you recall, when I was describing the application structure, we had this admin site that was sprinkled with React code throughout. So what I did before approaching management was I took those React-based pages and rewrote all of them in Hotwire, since it was a much smaller, more contained project, that then I could go to them and show them, here are the end results of this change, that I've got it working, it's got all of the feature set that we had before, it's much more maintainable, just as a proof of concept that this was something that could be done. And then these next 2 points were partially, maybe points to convince management, but also kind of additional benefits to this transition from how I felt it went. Almost everything starts to just look like Rails, and I'll show a little bit more of that later. But because it looks like Rails instead of being React or Redux or something other layer added into the mix, I felt like the barrier to entry was so much lower because you didn't need to know all these other things in order to read and understand the application. And we got to return it to the majestic monolith with Hotwire. The way the application was built before, they were in the same GitHub repository, but they were deployed separately as on separate servers, the client and the API. So with this, I was able to rebuild the client into the API part of the repository directly. So we didn't have this dual deploy anymore. We basically got to cut our server costs in half. So a little bit of fun with Hotwire. In React, this is a kind of an excerpt of code that I found littered throughout the application of whenever a component was going to asynchronously request data from the server, I always ended up finding code like this. We've got a piece of state that holds a loading Boolean that's defaulted to true, and it makes this API request, and if it doesn't error out, it sets the loading to false, and then re-renders whatever it got from the server. And this wasn't, I'm sure there are other ways of doing this in React, of abstracting it out to its own loading component or whatever, but this was one of the things that really started to irk me because this has nothing to do with the component itself. This just has to do with fetching data from the server and then knowing when it's done. So I took this example straight from the Hotwire website because this is one of the things that I first fell in love with, of just adding a turbo frame with an ID, and it'll just render those pieces out to you. But if you give it a source attribute, TurboFrame will know that that means go to that URL, get that content, find the piece of the response that has a TurboFrame with a matching ID, and render that in here. So you get this loading behavior just by default out of the box with Hotwire, which really just excited me from the get-go. And then we get Stimulus, which, with the JavaScript, the sheer amount of things that you can achieve with Stimulus in a minimal amount of code was really fun and exciting. So this is a controller I wrote for a freelance job, where the whole idea is that they wanted to have a max character count for a text area or a text field, and as you type into that field, it updates to show you how many characters you have left. So I've got 2 declarations for the targets and the values, and then a 2-line function that just calculates how many characters are remaining and sets that value. And so here's the view that uses that controller, where we've got a couple of data attributes littered throughout to specify the controller and how many characters are the maximum use case for that field. And then it just kind of works. You just start typing in there, and it instantly decrements those numbers or however it's supposed to work. So the stimulus just making it so easy to make really dynamic changes to the UI without requiring a whole lot of code and overhead was a lot of fun. And then the additional just beauty of Stimulus being this open source system that it is that people started creating these wonderful libraries of very generic, general use components that you can go and pull down. This happens to be my favorite library of components that I've been using, in particular the one at the bottom of the screen, Rails nested form. If anyone remembers like Cocoon or things like that before, this Rails nested form controller does all of that, and you have to write 0 JavaScript. You just include that package and structure the DOM the way it needs to be structured, and it'll just work. And it's just a beautiful thing. And then fun with turbo frames plus turbo streams. So again, this is from this freelance application that I did a while back. So with this screen here, we've got those links across the top in the orange. If you click on the edit, or I guess the edit's the primary one. If you click on the edit link there, it'll open up the form for this entry. But if you click the new button, it opens this new form over here. And you can fill it in and submit it, and it just creates this new entry right there. And all of this is happening without a single full page reload. This is all just happening in the context of that initial page. And then I can hit the new button again, and the form is still there. It's blank. I can create a new entry. And this is the thing I was talking about before, about how everything just looks like Rails. So here's the controller actions for the index and create actions, where nothing that's happening here tells you that anything's going on in terms of Hotwire or Stimulus or turbo frames, turbo streams. It just looks like a typical controller. And down here to I guess this is the index view. It still just looks like a really typical index view. Nothing's happening here that's really unusual. And it's only when we get down to the create.turbostream.erb file that anything looks different than normal. And even then, this is all pretty standard view logic, that if at the time that this code, instead of it being characters, it was a presentation. If the presentation was persisted, if it was saved to the database, then great. We want to render out a new presentation form, so we clear out the existing form and render out this new presentation that was created. And otherwise, if it wasn't, we want to render out the original form again with the data they submitted and whatever errors were inherent in why it wasn't saved. And so much of what attracted me to Rails when I was first learning Rails was this idea of just the conventions that were in place of how things could just work and read almost normally. And Hotwire has got me back to that place so much in terms of just React required so many different ways of thought about how to build the UI. And here I could get very dynamic interactions and dynamic pages that I could just write Rails, and it just made me so happy. And then this is the view at the layer of one of those objects, where the only thing out of normal for rendering the view is a turbo frame tag at the top of the page there, just to give it the DOM ID, so that when changes are going to be made to the UI, Turbo knows what to do with it. And that's all it really took. Lessons learned from this whole experience. Client-side state management is huge developer overhead, in my mind at least. Having to manage React and Redux and all of those other issues just to maintain the state of the application for the client, that's a whole lot of work that doesn't necessarily need to be done if you can just get whatever the current state is from the server the way Hotwire lets you do. So that was a big win for me. And this is the thing that I think is the biggest takeaway. In the situation that I was in with a small team that got even smaller due to attrition, Hotwire was especially well suited to meet my needs, to be able to build this dynamic system, and also minimize the skill set necessary for someone else to come in later and use it. Whereas with React, like I mentioned before, with React, it's never just React. It's React plus Redux plus Rekit in this case, and whatever else is layered in there. This way, like the developers who came after me on this project, all they really needed to know was Rails, and anything else they could figure out from the existing code. So I kind of mentioned that this was a bit of a story. So I started this project. I got management approval to spend however long it took to rebuild this React application into Hotwire. Ultimately, it took about 4 months to go from start to finish. And when it was launched, we had weekly kind of catch-up meetings to see how things were going, to show them the progress I'd been making. At the end of that 4 months, we launched that project, and I started working on updating one of the other projects to use Hotwire as well. And then I got a different job offer and joined my current company, CareRev. But I reached out to my former director in preparation for this talk to try and just see how things were going, see if they were still using what I had built. And he expressed that, yeah, they were still using it, they were still building on it. Everybody had been really pleased with how it had ended up. So that was kind of made me especially happy that I was able to find a way to help build that company and leave it a significantly better place than I had left it before. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have. This is my Twitter handle. Be warned, I don't really tweet about tech stuff all that often. It's mostly about my family and board games and other nerdy things. You've been warned in case you ever decide to follow me. And that's it. Thank you very much.